We worked with APSE for a number of years. APSE worked with many of your organisations as well, and we have a very successful relationship and lots of really interesting things going on. And I was just saying to Mo, it's a bit of a tradition, you know, each year we will have in our conference, there generally is always something from APSE, and it's always really interesting. And we were recalling that last year, for anybody who was at day 2 of the conference, Andy Mudd joined us and we did Blue Ocean Thinking, and it was a really, really good session. So Mo's going to talk to us today. She's going to pose some questions. She's actually, as Gary said, hopefully you caught that put some breaks in. So really interested to hear some of your views on our slides. But Mo's going to talk about some of the challenges and some of the facets of our topic today about commercial. And Mo, I was really interested in your title, you know, profit for a purpose or risky business. And I do recall, it doesn't seem that long ago, I was forbidden from using the word profit when working in local government. And risk is a key element of commercial. So really interested what Mo's got to hear. And I'd like to hand over to Mo.
Thank you ever so much. Thank you, Stephen, and thank you, Julie and Gary and the team at Scotland Excel for inviting me this afternoon. Do feel free to put any questions in the chat or any comments in the chat as we move through this afternoon. And I will apologise up front. I'm actually in Aviemore at our Fleet Grounds and Waste seminar, so I'm hoping that the internet holds out for me, because I do feel somewhat in the countryside when I'm delivering this presentation. So hopefully the internet is kind. So if I'm going to do a Chris Whitty, apparently, so if I could say next slide, please. Thank you. So I just wanted to really put this afternoon into some context. And as Steve said there, you know, profit's become a bit of a dirty word in the public sector. You know, it's not what we're here for, and why should we even consider it? But over the years, I think that attitudes have started to change, and in some ways go back to where we were originally. Local governments came about because of a gap in terms of what we were delivering to citizens. So going back many, many years, local government was given authority to run water, electricity, gas, even town police. I was in Oxford a couple of weeks ago, and there's a fantastic little museum there with the Oxford Town Police Guild still in this museum in all their tunics and finery. So we've historically had responsibility for lots of different services, and some beyond what we would now deem to be our traditional services. Social housing development became commonplace with the development of council housing, but in more recent times we've seen that perhaps morph into housing companies for some councils. County farms, when I first started working local government in city solicitors in Manchester, one of the joys I had was going out to our local county farms and getting lease re-signed from local farmers. They're holding on to those county farmlands was considered a welfare benefit, really, keeping agriculture at a local level. And of course, post-war, lots of new provision for local authorities, such as the Civic Restaurants Act. And that was designed to make sure that local authorities could respond to poor nutrition as a result of the rationing during the World War. So we've got this history of providing a whole range of different services. And then in the 70s, we started to look at, actually, is there something that we could sell to others in terms of making local government slightly more efficient? So the ability to sell surplus capacity came forward, and typically that would see something like IT facilities, IT capacity being sold through the local authority to the local economy. And those new powers in the 70s were restricted, really, and this continued for a couple of decades, to be related only to the functions of the local authority. So in other words, you could really do things so long as there was a provable case that there was a link back to the local authority as to why you were doing those things. Next slide, please. So where we've got to now, the new demands on services that we're seeing over, I think it's fair to say now, almost 2 decades, really, we've started to see this decrease in public service resources in terms of the genuine funding that is available to local authorities. but we're also seeing a growth in demand on local government services. We've had lots of calls for efficiencies, those of you who will recall the Gershon efficiencies, looking at a whole host of efficiencies, partnership working. And of course, just last week, a week before, the Accounts Commission for Scotland released the figures on the funding gap for Scotland: 585 million, 280 million potentially on a cumulative basis by 26-27. So what we're seeing is these pressures on public services really resulting in either a decision to remove or stop doing services, or to think about different ways we can fund those services and perhaps continue to deliver those services. So next slide, please. So key question, why would you want to raise money? Why would you want to make a profit for a purpose? This isn't profit going out to shareholders, but why would you want to make a profit for a purpose in local government? Well, one of the key drivers that we find from our member authorities isn't actually what you can get in for the service itself, but it's to try and flatten some of those central establishment charges we will typically see in local authorities. So that could be things like the cost of legal services, the cost of HR services, the cost of IT infrastructure. We know that we're continually under threat from, digital exposures that we see through our websites and through digital platforms. Lots of these things growing that cost to local authorities. So income of itself can help to kind of flatten those central establishment charges. It can simply make ends meet a bit easier. In many cases, we're seeing that income from trading and charging activities being used to invest in new services or support the hardest pressed local services. So some authorities say, we don't care if the money is raised through waste collection services, a commercial waste, or if it's raised in parks, but we want that money to come back in to support, for example, social care. It's not necessarily the case that the ring-fenced income, the income is ring-fenced to the service where it's earned. That is something that local authorities decide for themselves. But another reason why we see local authorities entering into the sphere of income generation is often that they can go in and regulate markets for public good. Now, typically, a few years ago, we were seeing extortionate costs for burial services, cremations and burials. And in many areas, a monopoly situation with undertakers where they controlled effectively local markets. So authorities started entering into that market to make really affordable funerals a key feature of their offering. And in some cases, that meant they bought the funeral director outright and just continued to operate it, but for public good. In others, it was to actually try and regulate that market to give an alternative offering to drive market prices down. So occasionally that can be what we would describe as local authorities acting in the sphere of market creation, making markets so that actually you can start to generate something good for your local economy. Next slide, please. And the types of areas where you might see this happening, there's a big difference that we're seeing across the public sector. Some of it is very, very low level. Some of it is very, very high level that you might want to do. So, for example, those issues of regulation of a market, in areas where authorities perhaps have a problem with rogue traders, people that are in some senses not checked or regulated in any way, knocking on an elderly person's door and saying, I can do some handyman work for you, but it's, this is the price, and then people getting ripped off or the work not being done to standard. So we do see now a lot of local authorities offering, for example, handy person services to their local residents, offering their own joinery services to a local authority, but not just to social housing tenants, but offering that to the broader residents in the area to basically mean that somebody turns up to do a job, but they've been checked by the local authority. They have the right background checks to be able to be entering into people's properties, and people are known to have been checked. So it's a form of market regulation in a way, but also making markets that hopefully you would attract better local businesses to go into that space. place. Parks and public realm has been another popular area, and this has been everything from putting franchises in parks, but also, you know, income from car parking being used to, for example, supporting new play equipment in parks. And then we see some really innovative examples. So for the picture there at the bottom of an ice cream van, you might think, well, what's an ice cream van got to do with local authorities? Sometimes this is about councils looking at how they trade in and charge fees for different services. And one area that we're all very keen on, lots of people have done it for many years, is you will license for a pitch for burger vans, for chip vans, for donut vans, for ice cream vans. We might charge £600-700 for that pitch, but actually the people on that pitch could make several thousand. So we're now seeing some local authorities who are saying, why are we franchising that out? Why are we just charging for the pitch? Why don't we actually run the ice cream van or run that fast food place? And then at the top there, we can see the investment level. That's actually a picture of a particular development scheme for a shopping parade in the Merseyside area of England. And that was a developer who'd let the council down on several occasions, continually promised that they would redevelop a site. And then that site was left to rack and ruin. It was causing all kinds of problems with vacated shops, with vandalism, and generally bringing down the whole area. So the local authority made a very brave decision to actually purchase and redevelop that for itself. So there are different scopes and different scales as to how we would intervene in local markets. But ultimately, they're all about actually doing public good rather than this being about, you know, let's make lots and lots of money and generate a profit. If I could just flip to the next slide, please. So what we would say, if you're a local authority looking at this, how do you determine what you want or need to do? Don't look at trading and charging and say, well, somebody over there is making a lot of money, I want to do the same. Or, you know, we've heard of this particular example, why can't we have that in our own back garden? What you need to think about is, what is the purpose of what you're doing? You know, what is the driver for this? What is the corporate commitment? Is this something that senior officers are wedded to? Is it something that you could embed that particular commitment within your elected members? And what's the risk appetite of elected members? Because depending on where and what type of activities you wish to get engaged in, that risk can be very, very minimal, something that's a completely reversible decision that you can pull back from very quickly. It could also be a very high risk proposition. So on that preceding slide, you know, the ice cream van, it doesn't work out, you resell it. It's not a big deal. You've not lost a lot of money. You can amend charges for a car park in a park, for example, within reason. You've got some flexibility. Going into buying a shopping centre and acting as a developer is at the other end of the scale, isn't it, in terms of that risk? So you need to consider the purpose of what it is you're trying to do, the corporate commitment of what it is you're trying to do, and most especially would say the risk appetite of elected members, because ultimately, whilst officers will obviously be nervous of these things, elected members will be found at the ballot box for decisions that they make that are not particularly popular and that don't work out. So that risk appetite of elected members is particularly important. Next slide, please. The other area you need to consider is your culture and your capacity within the local authority. And this is again somewhere that people struggle with, where ambition can sometimes be at odds with what the culture and capacity is within the local authority itself. And it's worth perhaps sometimes as management teams just going away and maybe sketching this out in a little bit of a workshop, doing it as a bit of a diagnostic workshop and looking at what kind of local authority you would consider yourself to be. And that would inform the issues around risk appetite and what the art of the possible is. So in a traditional public service setting, it's rather paternalistic, very social policy driven. You know, what is it that we're doing for our residents? Very much a societal focus. This is about doing good for local people. And often top down and very rules driven. And I know many of you on this call are obviously procurement professionals as well. So you'll clearly get that about, you know, the kind of the parameters and the rules by which we all work. There's also an issue with trading and charging as a culture across local authorities, and profit for a purpose being accepted within local authorities, that you don't have departmental barriers, and traditional structures tend to keep those barriers. So going back to the very start of this talk, we said, you know, think about, is it going to be income that benefits one department, or actually is all the income going to help one particular policy need and one particular resource need, for example, social care? And have you got corporate buy-in if it's a department, for example, that's running predominantly neighbourhood services, that their income is used to offset perhaps a lack of income elsewhere? So those departmental barriers can become quite pronounced when we're talking about income generation. And of course, in a traditional setting, a little bit more of risk aversity could expect to be found. We are seeing increase in the local authorities being much more on the entrepreneurial spectrum of an organisation. So perhaps a bigger risk appetite and willingness to get things wrong, because trading and charging, making profit for a purpose, is very much driven by, actually, you will make mistakes. And on the way to making those mistakes, you have to accept that they are inevitable and that you recover from them and you'll move on and learn from them. But it shouldn't be that if a mistake's made, everybody puts the barriers up and says, we can never do this again. An entrepreneurial organisation will typically be quite focused around innovation. It'll be open to innovation and taking a customer focus, a much more discerning approach. Traditional public services is, you know, this is what we are going to do, this is how we're going to deliver it, and there will be some choices but relatively limited. To get into a more commercial mindset, you need to actually be thinking about what does the customer want, and what the customer wants may be something that you haven't delivered or haven't delivered in that way before. So it can be taking people on a completely different journey. And for that, what we find is empowering managers to be able to manage and have that quite a disruptive effect in terms of how you would ordinarily deliver things is actually a helpful proposition. And the corporate culture overall has got to support entrepreneurship. So that means, in terms of those traditional, you know, cautious, departmentalised approaches, perhaps bureaucratic approaches we would take in a traditional public setting, in this setting of a commercial culture, you're looking more around agility and responsiveness. You know, you don't wait 6 months for a committee report to agree your next move. You will have to delegate responsibility, for example, setting pricing within parameters and allowing perhaps service directors to make those decisions. And then, of course, capacity to deliver. What you don't want to do is set yourself up to fail. If organisationally you are thin and threadbare and you're fraying at the seams through lack of capacity to deliver what you should be doing, then straying into commercialisation is a further danger that's going to stretch you further. Next slide, please. And, I wanted to just concentrate a little bit on the differences between charging and trading and the approach to investment based returns, because they are quite significantly different and each carries a different level of risk. So if I can take you through this, next slide, please. So the things that you will need to think about: who needs to do what. Think about culture and strategy. Think about identifying opportunities. Think about the development of business cases, and think about approvals and permissions. And these will be very different whether you're going on a charging, a trading, or an investment approach. And we're going to look at each of those areas in a little bit more detail. Next slide, please. So first of all, charging. If we look at charging parameters, I've used a piece of legalistic language here. It's a lift from the Localism Act, but it also found its place in the Local Government Act in 2003 as well. And I will caveat this by saying that Scotland has slightly different permissions to the rest of the UK now, because you do not have a general power of competence, and that was a key power that came in under the Localism Act 2011 for England, and for Northern Ireland in 2014, and for Wales in 2021. The charging parameters, so looking at, you are telling your local authority joiner to go and put a door on in a residence home, whether that be social, that's not social housing. It could be a private rented sector. It could just be a private house. So you're thinking, actually, we've got some capacity. They could go and fit a door for a resident, put a nice internal door on, put the screws on and a nice shiny handle, and we can charge for that. Now, taking one financial year with another, the income from charges imposed does not exceed the cost of provision. So what we're talking about there is that really charging is about cost recovery. The benefit to you as the local authority to get that cost recovery is, going back to what we said at the start, that flattens your central establishment charges. It's making you slightly more productive across your service, and therefore you're getting the income in that will cover some of the costs of that joiner who's going out and they're putting a new door on, for example. So charging is very simplistically, somebody is willing to buy something, you're willing to provide it, and they'll buy it at a price, and that price isn't really about profit. It's about simply covering the cost of you carrying out that service or providing that goods to that person, that individual, or that business. If we could just flick to the next slide, please. So what I want you to think about, and this is where I would like you to come in, and please don't all be very, very quiet. I do want you all to be discussing this one. If you think about the cost of providing a service, what we find from APSE is the public sector often understates the cost of provision. So they don't take into account what it really costs. So using that example of the local authority joiner, and I want people, if they can, put their hands up here or put it into the chat and I'll read your answers out. What do you think it is that it would take? What should we be considering as being the cost of provision, simply recovering those charges? What do you think goes into making up the cost of that goods or services? So I've got one person with a hand up. I've got April with a hand up. Do you want to come in, April? I think the hand's gone down again.
So Mo, it'll just take a second, so the guys have to open up the individuals.
Right, okay.
I can't see any hands anyway, so the guys will bring the individuals in.
Okay. So anybody got any hands up that they want to come in on this one, or do you want to put anything in the chat? All costs, labour and materials, good. Labour, materials, logistics, management, yeah. All good answers. Overheads, thank you, Shelley, for that. Anyone else? Yep. Lots coming in now. Elements of all support costs, materials, property costs, insurance, any other overheads, all support costs, IT, management, admin, actual cost of employing the person, NI and tax, insurance and travel, central support charges, HR, pensions, legal. I think we've got a bunch of accountants on this call, Stephen, this afternoon. Central support charges there as well. Absolutely excellent. And that is kind of where we get to. Cost of doing business, fixed cost, support costs, overhead costs, labour costs, materials. Excellent answers. If we could just move to next slide. Absolutely right. Those are the things that we would want you to consider. So looking at taking 1 year with the next, what's the cost of provision? Well, labour costs, NI, tax and pensions, and the central establishment charges, HR, legal services, procurement, all these things that have come here. Who's buying the supplies, who's buying in those internal doors and the hinges and the van, materials, but also depot storage, maintenance, utilities and stores, and then fleet and plant purchase, lease, repairs, maintenance, insurance. This morning I was on our APSE seminar here at Aviemore. Fleet and plant, huge issue there. People having lots of things that they were debating around the cost of changing fleet. Ancillary costs, health and safety, who carries out risk assessment, investments, PPE, training, and then marketing and delivery, website, invoicing, record keeping. Remember, this isn't an internal client, potentially it's an external client. So you're going to want to advertise your goods somewhere. You then need to invoice for those goods, and you'll need some record keeping. You'll perhaps need to look at how you account for any VAT issues on your supplies and your materials. So all good answers there. And I know that's just irked Derek, who missed out on procurement costs. Don't worry, we've got you there in terms of the procurement under the central establishment charges there, Derek and Lynn. So those issues there clearly all come in. So what this means is you might get somebody who says the cost of putting a door on is £150. Actually, when you take all of these things into account, the cost of putting that door on might realistically be the full £250 that you've charged back to that external client. But it still has a beneficial effect. It flattens those central overheads. It potentially gets a little bit more of a sweat from your assets in terms of your fleet and in terms of your depots. It all helps. But people often jump from charging into saying, well, this is trading, because we think the cost is £150 and we're charging £250. So it's £100. It's profit for a purpose. But, we've made some money on this. That isn't necessarily the case. So that piece of elastic, taking 1 year with another, what's the cost of provision? You will often find that the vast majority of things you want to do, in some senses, will fit in to that regime that we would class as charging rather than trading. Next slide, please. So what's trading? Well, trading is, I think, probably what we would describe as the quintessential profit for a purpose. So as opposed to charging, where you're just recovering your costs, trading is where you're setting out to make a return. So even considering all of the costs, the venture is set to still make a profit. So if we go back to the issue, that example of fitting a door in a private property, and you think under a charging provision it'd be £250. Under this, you might be getting away with charging £350, and genuinely £100 of that is profit. The difference, and why we'd refer to it as profit for a purpose, is unlike a private company that would return that money to shareholders for a private sector an equity return, this in itself is a return to the public's purse. So that may then become a profit, but it's a profit that's used to generate council-wide income or income into that service that's generated the profit. You make sure you define where that profit's going at the start, because often what can happen with a traded service, you can end up in a situation where you may go out into a really good business case and decide this is what we're going to do with this. Part of your business case may be we're reinvesting the profit in the service because it's a way of growing the service and perhaps growing the commercial structure of that service and being able to grow it even further. And then often what will happen is treasuries will get hold of that. Apologies to anybody who is from a bean counting disposition within a local authority, but what will often happen is treasurers will look across the budgets and go, well, hang on a minute, could we wire some of this money over to here, because this is a service that's on its knees and it's a statutory service and we need the money to make that service work. Over here, it's perhaps a non-statutory service that's made the money, but actually we could slim that service down. So it's important to define this for the purposes of your business case at the start. Next slide, please. Excuse me. Is trading risky? So the first thing is, do you have capacity or do you need to invest in that capacity? So going back to this question of what's the risk appetite, if you have just about cut your cloth to suit in terms of being able to deliver your service, that's a very different proposition to going to the point where you need to take on new people to deliver a completely new service and deliver a new business case. Is your proposition untested? Is this something that you're aware of in terms of market testing a service? What have you got by local information? Is this a service that's needed? Are you going to be a market disruptor? And also, what are the failure risks? So if you're in that position as a local authority of delivering a particular commercial venture, What are your failure risks? If you've invested, perhaps brought in new staff to deliver this, do you place a service at risk of redundancy? You know, you bring these people in, your business case fails, you don't have people that can actually deliver anything because they're not selling enough to deliver anything, they're not producing enough to deliver anything. So that failure risk needs to be taken into consideration, because trading is more risky. You're setting yourself out with a fully developed business case, a fully developed proposition to elected members to say, this is what we want to embark on. So that issue of capacity, issue of whether you need investment, and if you do need that investment, are you going to make the return on that investment by having a successful trading proposition? Next slide, please. So again, I just want to get some thoughts from yourselves. And again, you can either put your hands up, or if you want to put it in the chat, as we did with the charging question. What could possibly go wrong with trading? So this is where you're selling something for a profit. In effect, you want to make profit for a purpose. So I'm going to stop there for a little minute. I'm going to grab a quick glass of water. And if you could start putting your answers in the chat or putting your hands up.
I'm sure the comments will come flowing in a minute. So I'll talk in the meantime while we're waiting in comments, just in case I can't see any. So one of the aspects you kind of touched on was perception, so public perception. So business commerce is completely linked with failure, and business ventures fail. Is that acceptable? Well, no, it's generally unacceptable from a public's point of view. So yes, that's a big barrier.
Absolutely.
And all the comments are coming in now, Mo, so we'll go with that.
They are, yes, thank you, Steve. So low demand, absolutely. We've just come out of a fairly unique period of very high inflation, people choosing what they will or won't spend the money on in terms of any non-essential spend. So this is impacting across the economy. So low demand is a really, really good answer. Challenge from an external provider. I'm not sure, Brian, whether you mean they're a legal challenge or whether you mean simply a challenge in terms of there's somebody else that's better. And both actually are challenges. We have had challenges, for example, in the commercial waste sector from a private provider who said that there was an advantage to the local authority because of VAT, and they argued that it was effectively fixing the market. So there was quite an extensive legal case on that. But also from that external provider, somebody coming in and perhaps undercutting you because you're going to be providing these services with people on decent pay and pensions. Hopefully it's not being used to reduce that good employer status. So those challenges certainly there. The appetite for products or services, you've got to be very fleet of foot in many businesses that you're keeping up with the latest technology, the latest developments, the latest trends from consumers. So, you know, and what we also know is we may be trying to perhaps provide greener services to the local authority. They're often a little bit more expensive. And although customers like to virtue signal and say, yes, I always buy green, you know, you often see this, don't you? If you go down the supermarket aisle where they have all the sort of eco-over and all the, you know, trendy products that have got, you know, I think there might be just water actually, because the list of things that they don't contain is probably bigger than the list of things they do. And actually they could be next to an identical product for £1 and it's £2.40, and you see people putting it going, oh, and then they see the price and they put it back and they scurry back to their £1 option. So often, you know, consumers can be very discerning about what they do or don't say, and what they can sometimes say in response to market consultation of, oh yes, I'd love the option for a greener local service and local supply chains. Price sensitivity can come into this. Faulty goods, you provide something that's faulty, you have to rectify it and it goes back potentially to a supplier, but it could take you a long, long time to recover your money on that. Bad debt, competition and reputational risk. Again, excellent answers there, James. Particular reputational risk, if you set off doing something and it fails, you are then, as the local authority, more likely to make the front pages than the next person. The other issue as well, competition with local businesses there, that's come up from Mary. Mary's put in competition with local businesses, and the council role in community wealth building might be in conflict with this. Absolutely fantastic answer there, Mary. In Wales, the trading provisions in Wales that came under their Local Government Act specifically compelled the Welsh local authorities to do a local sensitivity analysis. They had to make sure that whatever the councils were doing in terms of trading activity was not pushing out a local supplier. Now, you may, for example, take the case of there's a commercial opening for commercial window cleaning on premises. And the council doing that with proper safety equipment, etc., might be a fantastic thing that you think, oh, everybody wants to do this. But in the process of doing that, you squeeze out maybe 2 or 3 local window cleaners. That isn't the position, reputationally or otherwise, that local councils want to be in. And there's certainly this conflict. Local councils can use their spending power, their procurement power, to enhance the use of local suppliers to what they're doing. And it might be about nudging other people in the local area and in local businesses to also use local suppliers as part of your community wealth building strategy. But if you're then the bad guy that comes in to push all those local suppliers out anyway, the local businesses, that reputational issue has certainly got to be considered. Compliance with goods and services legislation, absolutely. And Ian, we're going to come very swiftly on the end of today to talk just very briefly about the general power of competence, which isn't in place yet within Scotland. So we will touch on those powers issues. Managing customer services, ensuring quality of goods and services, demand planning, all of those supply line issues. Absolutely, Lynn. Really important to remember that when you're trading and you're trading for a profit, your customer is going to be much more discerning. This isn't somebody phoning the council and getting what they've always got, which is, the one product, one service. This can be about actually customers demanding something very quickly, being as slick with your website as kind of the likes of Amazon. Are you also interested in this? Most councils, in terms of IT, it's got a functionality, but it's also got a veil for the council. It protects the council in terms of GDPR, personal information, access to services. We're not always that fleet of foot when it comes to behaving like the private sector, when it comes to some of our open systems facing out to the public. Some of our IT, our websites can be quite sluggish. It's a very, very different proposition when you're in that trading frame, and you need to be much more responsive to customers. So really is important there. Again, regulatory requirements coming up there. Where markets are, the supplies to markets are private sector, possibly making a loss on some services. Could we price match in those situations? Again, this came up in one of our Welsh authorities. They were building their own social housing. They used local supply chains. The construction costs went up, and the construction supplies went up as a result of the inflation, cost of living, and post-Brexit in terms of the construction supplies. And in that case, they ended up having to top up their suppliers beyond the price that had been agreed in order to keep the social housing building projects on track, but also to keep those businesses open. So it's a risk in that, you're not necessarily a set price on some of these things. And internal governance processes, limiting ability to take commercial decisions quickly. Absolutely, Melanie, that is the case. And I like Colin's answer that sums this up nicely. Everything, revenue not meeting business costs equals business failure. So prefix back to you, Colin, for that answer. That really is concise. So if we go into the next slide, please, this is just probably a good summary of your answers. So markets, internal clients, cost assumptions, growth of clients and new business, the risk appetite, that mismatch, and bureaucracy, and then skills to deliver, and also the culture. The culture's, again, pretty important. But also one last one here, displacement from the day job. If we're good at doing a good service, and we might be able to make a little bit more from charging. It does not necessarily make us the next Alan Sugar. It doesn't mean to say that we're going to necessarily go on and make lots of money. Now, local authorities are good at lots and lots of things. We've got lots of entrepreneurial authorities that have actually delivered. They've been the saving grace for, particularly for neighbourhood services where the gaps in funding are the greatest. However, we have to be careful. Is this something we have? And it goes back to that question of capacity, something we can do. Next slide, please. And the third sort of strand to this is investments. So property and assets, hotels, businesses, developments, housing, regeneration. We're increasingly seeing local authorities looking to perhaps make a little bit more in terms of their property and asset space. So perhaps looking at investments. And going back to the very, very second slide, not the first slide, the very second slide, we talked about, councils in the days owning farms and different assets. In some ways, some councils have held on to them. In others, councils have disposed of those assets over the years. They've liquidated those assets to help meet revenue costs. And we've seen a reinvigoration of councils saying, well, actually, we've got this land. Rather than just having, a developer come on and take the land, perhaps we own that land as a head lessor. A hotel goes on there, we will receive the rents on that property, that hotel business for decades to come. Maybe investing in businesses that they feel has got the opportunity for a return. Looking at how they could do developments. I mentioned earlier the shopping centre development. Many councils have engaged in things like the development of local housing companies, and they've looked at issues like regeneration. So using investment to create really more of a levelling up approach to regeneration, where developers perhaps might not be interested. You might not be the all singing, all dancing council that they want to engage with, but actually you still want to deliver something for your local economy, and you believe you've got a genuine opportunity to have investment in a regeneration type approach. So property assets, all of those things could be part and form part of that. Investments is using public money to make a return, and it's clearly at the other end of the scale from charging. So you've got charging at a relatively low risk, trading where you're getting into some risky territory, and investments at perhaps a significantly more risky area of the public sector. Next slide, please. So what could go wrong? And again, it's over to yourselves. What could possibly go wrong if, as a council, you set out and you decide to take an investment approach in a housing company, in perhaps a shopping mall, in perhaps looking at a hotel business, and you decide these are things that we should really do because we could think we can make a big, big return. So what could possibly go wrong with investments? And again, I'm going to stop to allow a little minute for the chat. Do come into the chat box with your answers on this one. And, or as I say, feel free to put your hand up. Thank you.
So whilst we're waiting, Mo, I'll say everything. Yep, some good answers coming through here. Yeah, all good answers so far. Clearly, I think the one that James has put at the top there around changing political will between elections, you do on a long-term investment, and most investments are longer than the life cycle of a local council. You are really tying the hands of your successors. So it's really important, and we've produced some guidance, some governance on risk management for elected members a few years ago on this. Tying the hands of your successors is never particularly popular, and it's really important that opposition councillors, scrutiny, audit are all consulted in terms of what that investment means. External influences, the COVID pandemic, absolutely. So hotels closed. Many went into, administration at that point in time. They couldn't cope, even with the furlough money and things. We saw lots of businesses closing. So things that are beyond your control can of course happen.
And dependent on when you buy, values can, of course, go down as well as up, the cliche. But you can see a loss of value. You may think that, you know, a site for development's fantastic, it's really good, it ticks every box, and then you lose an anchor retailer. You know, for example, if you've got a Marks and Spencer's or something of that ilk, and they shut up shop and go, you'll often find other retailers going with them. So this pull to market forces, you know, all kinds of ethical issues that come into there. Colin's clearly been reading lots of crime novels over the spring. Enter into a business agreement with serious organised crime equals reputational damage. Your life is more exciting than mine, Colin, but you're absolutely right. You could end up, you know, there are some very serious, nasty characters out there, and you could well end up being hoodwinked into something that on the face of it looks like it's a legitimate organisation, but actually there may be some serious discrepancies. So those due diligence arrangements about who is you're investing with, they could be, you know, seriously problematic. Darren's made the point about, you know, getting investment funds to begin with. Absolutely. There's been an encouragement for public sector pension funds, for example, to invest in local areas, but they have their own strategy for investment. They want to make sure that they're getting a return for future pensioners. So even if you have this fantastic idea that if we do this, we're going to get these, you know, great returns, well, actually, the pension fund may say it doesn't stack up for us in terms of those investments. So you're often relying on, you know, ensuring that you're able to access the capital to do that. And a great answer there, Derek's just put public money, taxpayers' money, being perceived as being gambled on the open markets by people not suitably qualified, and the long-term impacts if it goes wrong. And again, absolutely, you have a higher level in the public sector, I would argue, than anywhere else, because you have that responsibility in terms of your duty of best value. You have your financial standing orders. You need to be compliant with regulation and codes of practice to make sure that what you're doing is not taking those risky gambles with public money. That's a much higher level than you might see if it was private equity that we're talking about. So again, excellent answers there. Thank you to everybody in the chat there for your comments. Really helpful comments. If I could just say next slide, please. This is just a bit of a summary of those answers, really. Investment risk, yeah, it's a cliche, but the value of investments can go up as well as down. And argue that higher duty of care, this is public money, not private equity. So you need to be really careful of those issues. Due diligence is not negotiable. A local authority has to do due diligence, and that should go through several experts. It's not, you know, you can't take reliance on one person. You need to go through a number of experts to ensure that's the case. And things like the financial standing orders, CIPFA is a great organisation, do always take into consideration that you're looking at their best practice, you're looking at the CIPFA codes. There's also been really strong advice coming forward around borrowing in advance of need. So that is different to borrowing for needs that meet your functioning of a local authority. Borrowing in advance of need, where you're borrowing in order to support investment that may or may not make those returns. And that's something that's been very much frowned on. And is there a link? Really? You know, we're not saying don't do investment. Councils have been doing investments for years. Do it with the appropriate advice. Always take appropriate advice. But think about whether there should be a link to local regeneration or wealth. In other words, is it strictly a commercial issue, or actually, going back to the start, is it this market maker that if markets have let local areas down, is there something you can do to be that anchor personality in the local economy, bringing others together, perhaps being the linchpin for some investment around some regeneration and some development, but using your links and your ability as a local authority to partner people into those situations. So those are some of the things that you need to be really cautious of. But as I say, that's at the higher end of the scale, much higher duty of care, much higher due diligence needed from local authorities. And you need to be absolutely aware and eyes wide open. Investments will go up as well as down. And that doesn't, we're not ring fenced because we're the public sector to those risks. It's why every year our pension funds all go back and do their reevaluations. I think it's every 3 years they're compelled to do that, but they reevaluate their stock in trade, if you like. They reevaluate their worth because they are playing in markets and very expert in doing so, but with those expert advisors. So investment risk is a different prospect. Going back to the issue about profit for a purpose, it can still mean that that investment income coming into you is used for public good rather than private equity going out to shareholders. So it's not entirely that this isn't profit for a purpose. It absolutely can be profit for a purpose, but we have to be acutely aware that that's a much bigger risk than anything else that you're likely to do. Next slide, please. And finally, I'm just going to take the next few minutes just to look at the power of general competence, because talking about trading and charging would be very, very difficult without us looking at the power of general competence and asking the question, is Scotland missing out on this? Now, the reason I raise this question is everywhere else in the UK is now covered by the power of general competence. Next slide, please. So for England, Wales and Northern Ireland, they have a general power to allow local authorities to do anything which is not specifically prohibited by law, allowing innovation in response to local need. They can do it anywhere in the UK or elsewhere. So that means they could invest in, if we take the case of investment in a hotel, they could invest in a hotel in France, and for commercial purpose without a charge. So you might be looking to do this to make some money. You might be looking to do it just because it's a good thing for your local authority. And the important bit here is it's for the benefit of the area, authority, its area or persons, resident or present or otherwise. We used to work off a well-being power under Section 2 of the Local Government Act, and that basically anchored everything to saying you are doing it for local well-being, for local residents. So the power of general competence has expanded that quite significantly for England, for Wales and Northern Ireland, and it isn't yet in place within Scotland. Next slide, please. So in addition to those older powers that we've referred to, things like the Goods and Services Act, the additional older powers to trade and charge, the general power of competence arguably removes some of that uncertainty. It widens the charging provisions that we had under Section 93 and Section 95, in fact, for the trading powers as well. The provision of the Act to the power to charge where there is a power to provide. So under the general power of competence, it's not limited in any way. You can simply do it. And trading for commercial purpose, the restrictions there that still continue even under the general power of competence is that trading should be through a company if it's making a profit. Going back to that issue, how do you define what's a profit? Because that cost of the provision is really important. But arguably, it gives a much wider basis for existing trading and charging powers. But especially for Scotland, because within Scotland, there's been a bit of a standoff, really. Government hasn't said what its limitations are in terms of using trading and charging, but some councils have taken that to mean, hey, we'll do it anyway till somebody tells us not to. And other councils have said, we're not doing it. It's too risky. So a general power of competence, it's often described as a power of first resort. I would argue that's not necessarily the case. You still need to look at pre-commencement prohibitions in terms of what you're doing, but those are some of the considerations. Next slide, please. And these are the restraints. Where a general power of competence has been introduced, there have been restraints by reserving powers to the relevant Secretary of State or Minister. And this has been the case in England. It was exactly the same in terms of Northern Ireland in 2014 and exactly the same in Wales in terms of a couple of years ago. So what it's basically saying is the relevant Secretary of State can say, yes, you've got the general power of competence, There are things that you can't do that we told you couldn't do before, the pre-commencement legislation, and you still can't do them. But by the way, as Minister, I will decide if I don't like something that you're doing in the future, I reserve my powers to stop you doing that. So that restraint is really significant. So I don't want people to go away from this afternoon's talk thinking that this is some kind of a nirvana, because wherever it's been introduced with those restrictions. Governed by public law principles is the key thing. It's about doing what an ordinary person can do as the council. So I may be able to go up and set up a business that's a legitimate business, but I couldn't go up and set a business as a hitman. It's clearly unlawful. I couldn't do it. It doesn't give you the carte blanche to do absolutely anything. And express restraints are things like the equalities legislation. Everything you do as a public body should still keep that in mind. Generally, you're not permitted to misuse public funds, and taxation is clearly defined as not being able to use GPC to raise local taxes. And of course, one of the quotes that we had was no thermonuclear warfare. There are things that you are otherwise restricted from doing that you cannot do. Next slide, please. It was brought in because of the famous Lamel case, the local authorities mutual case. Local authorities in London were trying to secure, through joint procurement, a saving in terms of their insurances, and they were effectively restricted from doing that. There was a judicial review. But the government at the time promised to reduce the limits of the wellbeing power. So going back to that issue about hotel investments, the worst thing you can do is put all your eggs in one basket. So if you're investing in hotels, you're going to do it in different areas, because different economic impacts will potentially be better, is the accepted wisdom on investments. So if you had 6 hotels in one area that was hit by a massive flood, you've lost your investment. So common sense dictates you would hedge your bets and put that in different areas. Wellbeing didn't allow you to do this. So one of the primary thoughts behind GPC was, allowing that to go outside of local areas, and that was clarified. But there are still some grey areas for charging and trading in terms of, how far is this supported by the public sector, and does it cut across unfair competition issues? So it is not a panacea. Next slide, please. And as I say, the limitations, when this was introduced into Parliament, Eric Pickles famously said, it falls short of being able to saddle up your horses, arm your citizens and invade France. So in other words, you cannot do anything that you would want to do. There are those public law limitations, allowing, it doesn't allow a qualifying authority to do things post-commencement that you were not allowed to do. Charging, for example, for collection of domestic waste. That's an obvious example. Next slide, please, which should be coming towards the end now. Lots of people ask the question about local authority companies. Do you need one? Next slide, please. We would always say there are some disadvantages to companies. Taxation, proper analysis is needed. It isn't a quick process. You still need to test your markets. And immaturity of a company if its finances fail, but you also need to think about TUPE. Don't do this to try and escape equal pay. You will be classed potentially as a comparator employer. You will potentially be subject to action on that. And the company veil is little protection where the council's the sole shareholder. So some of the things that we've seen, there was a case in the Midlands recently over the last 4 or 5 years where there was a big investment in an energy company, a renewables company. Had that investment been allowed to continue, it may well have started to make the returns that were promised. However, what happened there was that they ended up under that company veil, being they were giving loans to the company. So when that company went bust, the shareholder council effectively still took the hit. Next slide, which should be my final slide. And always remember who wants to be the company. And I'm going to finish on this slide, the customer. Lots of people set out really liking the idea of being, able to sell things to others, make some money for their local council, bring some money back into local services, plug some of those financial gaps. But if you want to ask yourselves honestly this question, who is it that wants to be the customer? Because I would hazard a guess that if we were to do a show of hands and say, who wants to be the customer, very few hands would go up. If we were to do a show of hands and say, who wants to be the shopkeeper, who wants to sell, I suspect that everybody on this call would stick their hand up. And that's the dynamic you face. You may all want profit for a purpose, for your local economy, for your local council, for your local people, but it's far harder to realise it because everybody in local government wants to be in this space. Few want to be the customer. Everybody wants to be the entrepreneurial shopkeeper. So I'm going to stop there. I know I'm a minute over time, but hopefully not too bad. And I think the very last slide is just my contact details there. Sorry, number one tip, expert advice. Next slide is my contact details. So if any of you want to get in touch, do feel free. And I know Scotland Excel will very diligently share the slides, I believe, from today. So if any of you want any clarity, want to come back on anything, please feel free. I will stop there, Stephen, but thank you very much for the invitation this afternoon.
Thanks, Mo. And if the guys stop sharing, so Mo, that was excellent. That was a really good presentation. We really enjoyed. And I'm going to open up for, and we'll see if we can get at least one question in. And Mo, you did so well that you actually answered my question in the last slides, because you made me think, what is Scotland missing out without that general power of competence? I think the big thing for me is understanding that, but also that topic that came up a number of times in the chat that you invoke people to think about is the challenge of becoming an economic operator rather than an economic enabler. And that's something, that's a real tension we're going to have to all look at before we even consider some of those other elements.
Yeah.
So I don't see many questions coming up, Mo, but that was fantastic. We will be sharing the slides. What we do, Mo, is, and we'll summarise this at the very end presentation, quite often people will say, actually, we want to hear a wee bit more about that, so we might run longer sessions and things like that. So, but we'll come back to that. So all I'd like to say is thank you very much. Hope the rest of your conference goes well, and we really enjoyed today, Mo. So thank you very much, and thanks to everybody for attending. Our next session will start at 3:30, and we'll be hearing from Alistair Young, Associate Director from Net Zero Transport, and we'll be hearing about net zero. So thank you, Mo.
Thank you for the invite, and have a great conference. Bye bye.